Hello, today is May 18th, 2023. I'm meeting today with Mr. William B. Holmes, Jr. at his home in Lafayette, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans History Project. Welcome, Bill, and thanks for sitting down this afternoon to tell your story.
Very happy to do that. It's a privilege. Thank you.
Very good. Let's start out, if we could. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your date of birth, where you were born, a little bit about your family.
Okay. Born on October 4th, 1939 in Greenville, Texas. Lived there with grandparents and so forth that took pretty good care of me, particularly when my father was in World War II.
Okay.
He was skipper of a minesweeper in World War II, and I remember I was just very young when he went back and forth for minesweeper training in Yorktown, Virginia, and then they went to the West Coast and was deployed. So my real early life, the first couple of years or so, well, not the first, but sometime in the early 40s, he was sweeping mines near Shanghai and that type of stuff. So, and got some great pictures from him and all that. I hit the jackpot as far as dads were concerned because he was really super. Mother was a very normal homemaker, but one full of caring and love. And so, particularly when I was in the Marine Corps, I realized how fortunate I was to in the lottery with my parents. At age 6, we moved to Lubbock, Texas. My father was a civil engineer, had worked for the Corps of Engineers after his service, and built a lot of dams around the country. So we moved a lot and wound up in Lubbock, Texas as Director of Public Works for Lubbock. And because we weren't extremely rich, I went to school at Texas Tech because I could live at home, and that was a good deal. Graduated from Texas Tech in 1962. I managed to cram 4 years of hard study into 5, changing majors regularly, and that really kind of led to the path where I wound up in the service. I was in the Air Force ROTC from the freshman on, and accepted an Air Force contract to become a pilot. And the last year of school, I needed to take it's convoluted, but I needed to take another course and couldn't take political geography or international politics or something that was required for that contract. So it kicked me out of my Air Force contract, and because I couldn't fulfill that, and I enrolled in the Marines Aviation PLC, Platoon Leaders Class.
Well, now, of all the various services, how did you come to choose the Marines? Because of the aviation?
Well, I wanted to be a naval aviator.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I entered the reserve without going to boot camp, and then when I graduated, I went to the PLC, which of course is I believe the 6-week boot camp, and then after your commission, you go into a 6-month infantry commander's infantry school where you can become a platoon commander. Obviously, at the end of that, when I was commissioned, they said I had a slight stigmatism in my right eye, and they needed a bunch of ground troops. So they didn't allow me to go in as a naval aviator, and so I said, well, at least put me in the air wing. So that's how I wound up being an air control officer in the Marine Corps. And so the rest is pretty much history. I started off at Cherry Point, North Carolina.
Now, what year was this?
Okay, and I went into the active reserve while I was still in college. I believe it was 1961, and probably by the late 1961, I think I went into graduated. No, I graduated in 1962. It's a little foggy after all these years. I graduated from Texas Tech in 1962, immediately went into the platoon leaders class, and so I went into basic school. That's what they call it. That's my dog. And went to Cherry Point, North Carolina after that 6 months, and from there was in the Marine Air Support Wing, and we were transferred to El Toro out in California, and at that time the VC had just overrun the or they started filtering into Vietnam, and so I was stationed at Da Nang Air Force Base.
Well, so you were early on when we were really still sending advisors and what have you. We hadn't full on. Wow.
Yeah, and I didn't go to Vietnam until about the last 6 months of my tour, which was in 1965. So I wasn't really in Vietnam until 1965, and that was on the last 6 to 9 months of my tour, I can't remember. And flew back and was released from the service in December of 1965. I mentioned that story to you.
Yeah, I'm going to have you tell that story here in a minute, but I definitely want to go back in country and talk a little bit about that. Well, how was that then? I guess you had pretty much the ROTC through college, so I don't know, was that much of a transition then from civilian life, if you will, into the Marines, or
yeah, well,
ROTC did that soften it up things a lot?
No, absolutely. It was a major transition, and particularly in school while I was in college, I was going into the active or the weekend warrior type things, and until I graduated and then went to. So it was kind of a convoluted situation, but we made through
and it had to be a major disappointment to be told that, well, with that stigma, you're not going to be flying.
Yeah, it was, but in the long run, if things I'm the kind of believer that things happen for the best. But I realized later on in life that I didn't have maybe the concentration and focus that I needed to be in that cockpit and be directing, instantaneous stuff. Yeah. I make decisions fairly quickly, but I didn't. My wife became a pilot, and I flew with her a little bit in the later years, and I realized that I didn't really want to spend 2 hours focusing on instruments and so forth. And so I got a jet ride from a friend of mine who was a test pilot in the overhaul and repair squadron, and so I got a Mach 2 pin, but I got a flight in a F-4 Phantom, which was really amazing. But I wound up being basically in the control area versus.
Okay. And going over to Vietnam, you guys fly over, take a ship over. How'd you guys?
Let's see. We flew. Boy, that's good. We flew to. No. I was. I back up a little bit. After El Toro, I was stationed at the Marine Corps Air Station in Okinawa. Trying to think of the name of that. It was an air station that caused quite a bit of conflict later on. The Okinawa people didn't want them, the base to be permanent there, and it was convoluted. But from there, we got on a LST ship and shipped to Vietnam. So it was I don't know, 5 or 6 days or something like that, or maybe it wasn't even that long. But again, hard to remember at this point.
How was that for a West Texas boy going to sea? Did you get your sea legs?
I tell you what, the LST is a flat bottom boat that runs into the shore and opens the doors, and the tanks and everything roll out. So it doesn't have a keel.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a keel like a lot of them. and we got into a storm, and that thing was making sways to within 30 degrees of the horizon. And I was officer of the deck one night, and I got totally sick, and I had to go down, and they had all this equipment. It's usually a tank deck, but it's equipment for all of our vehicles and control devices, and they were all chained down to the deck. But the officer of the day had to go in and check those, and with the seas rolling, that was a night that I won't soon forget.
Oh, man.
So that's probably maybe the most harrowing experience I had. But it was, and then we landed at Da Nang.
Were you part of that initial Marine landing at Da Nang, the big landing?
I don't think we were part of the initial. I think we came in shortly after that.
Okay.
When they needed the equipment, but no, we didn't do the beachhead or anything like that. No.
Okay, so now you're halfway around the world in this foreign land. Once you guys landed, I imagine you had to start from scratch and set things up, or?
Yeah, we set things up, but we had, of course, the Marine Corps runs on its NCOs, non-commissioned officers, and we had some of the best, and so they were good at setting up the equipment, and they had a direct air support unit, a bubble that was fiberglass that they put up, and where the general basically controls all the air. We didn't see the general much, but we had all that set up, and we had a computerized bombing device called the ANPQ-10, and it triangulated the target, the plane, and our control center. And so it was a higher altitude bombing device, and we would lock on the plane in this thing and guide it over the target, and we would, as controllers, we would give him bearings and say come left or right, and finally when he was over the target, we'd give him a mark, which
Wow.
means they dropped their bombs, and he was probably 10,000 feet. So they calculated the path of the bombs and all that stuff, and theoretically it was supposed to really surprise the VC, Viet Cong, and being a computer type of device, it was down a lot, and we had technicians working on the thing and all that stuff. So quite frankly, I'm not sure we ever hit anybody, but it was at least an experience of actually controlling an aircraft.
So you did more than, you think of an air traffic controller, keeping planes apart and
Yeah.
landing them properly. You were also involved with site bombing then, or setting up the bombing runs and what have you then as well?
Yeah. You get a plane on a bombing run, and you tell them the direction he was supposed to be heading, and then you correct it for the wind and all that stuff. And he stayed at a certain altitude, and again they compute the path of the bomb and all that stuff. I've forgotten all the technical terms,
Yeah.
but.
Now, would you coordinate with ground troops as well to make?
I think the ground troops had given them the target.
Oh, okay, all right. So you didn't have to worry about friendly fire.
The target was in the machine, so
Okay.
we didn't. All we did is direct out.
Now, was there a base there at Da Nang, or did you guys have to build an airstrip?
We camped. We were in strong back tents and had foxholes and everything there on the side of the Da Nang airport. So we were stationed kind of off the Da Nang airport. And an interesting story about that, there was I'm trying to think, a F-105 squadron that also had their planes out there and so forth. And one night the VC came through, and the pilots and everything had to evacuate, and they left their tents and stuff there. And of course the VC tried to go in and damage the planes and so forth. And the next morning they found, and VC would get kids to do their work for them a lot of times. And so the next morning, they went back in the tents and found grenades that didn't have the pin pull. So these kids were so inexperienced, they'd go in and throw the grenade in there, and they didn't pull the pins. That's how crazy this war was. I mean, it just was an absolute ridiculous, thing. But, and the way, of course, in my opinion, the way it was continued to be fought was, it shaded my opinion of a lot of politicians and their integrity.
Yeah.
When you send 50,000 more troops in, and you can't win the war.
Right. Yeah.
That was. But I'll carry that later on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you pretty much had a rough camp. That wasn't. Did you ever move into Quonsets or anything?
Well, we had strong back tents, which means that you got a frame and the tent goes over it.
Oh, okay.
And we had a bit of a floor in it, so it wasn't. It wasn't like really a hardship. I mean, not like the guys out in the bush that were living out in tents and all this stuff. And I had great regard for them. And we went out on a few flights and things like that, bring back wounded and also some body bags and so forth. So.
But and you talked about that VC attack. You felt relatively safe there, or?
Yeah, the outskirts did a fairly decent job of protecting us. We just got in it. We had a foxhole trench near our tent that we could get in, and we grabbed our weapons and we were ready to go if they got to us. Fortunately, they didn't, so we were pretty fortunate there.
Yeah. And food and such was adequate, or what was?
Food was okay. I'll tell you in the story about we had a little bit of powdered milk. I mean, we had very little, fresh milk, which I loved at that time, and so I'll tell you the story when you're ready for it about the trip back.
That's right. Yeah, definitely want to get that. Yeah. And so, how long did you say you were in country then?
I'm thinking it was 7 to 8 months. And I took a trip back to Okinawa to have a cartilage removed from my knee. I damaged a cartilage in training. And I wanted to get that fixed before I got out. And so they shipped me back to Okinawa. I had the surgery and came back to Vietnam.
I know often many people took R&Rs. Did you get an R&R in there as well?
No, I didn't. That was my R&R.
Oh, was it? Okay.
In 8 months, that was probably my closest. I did. Let's see. No, I take that back. I did go to Hong Kong for a couple of days and stayed in a nice hotel there and so forth. So that I'm recalling that now. I did go to Hong Kong for an R&R, but it wasn't a long time. It was.
Yeah. And how about once again? I keep going back to this West Texas boy, and the dry climate compared to the climate in Vietnam. How was that adjusting to? And did you have to deal with any of the?
In the fall in Vietnam, there's a monsoon season. And I think for us it was, I don't know how many, I can't remember how many weeks or whether it was all month or whatever, but I know they had 30 inches of rain.
You get about half of that in West Texas in a year, right?
Within a reasonably short period of time, month and a half or something like that. So it was wet, and the biggest thing was that we had the natives they had hired to do our cleaning, and so our uniforms. So they'd take the uniforms and hang them over fires in tents, and if I remember right, they used cow dung for the dried cow dung to fuel the fires. So you'd get these beautifully starched dungarees, and they'd smell a little bit. So just a lot of little goofy experiences like that you wouldn't experience at home.
Would you, outside of the house people and cleaners and stuff. Did you associate much with the natives? Did you able to get into Da Nang and walk around, or?
You could. I didn't do a whole lot of that. I went in and took a few pictures and things, and I wasn't good about going to bars and stuff like that. So I didn't go as much as some of the others, but I went in occasionally, yeah, and just viewed the town. There were a lot of concerns. All the bars had grills on the windows, so the VC couldn't come along and throw grenades in there and disrupt things. But I guess I spent most of the time on the base or at our base, because we had a lot of activity going on air-wise.
What would you guys do when you weren't on duty to kill the time and entertain yourselves? Or was there much time off?
I guess we played poker a little bit. We'd get haircuts. Pretty boring stuff for people who think war is always exciting activities. So, but we had our moments, but it wasn't you just in the old deal of the services say hurry up and wait. It's you have hours of boredom, and then maybe you might have a few hours of activity or action.
And what about communications, news and information about how the war, as the war was flaring up, how that was going, world affairs, news from home, letters from home. How were you getting or not getting that?
Yeah, we were fortunate. We got a lot of letters from home. I really consider my tour as extremely lucky, because I didn't face a lot of enemy fire. To be candid, I didn't. We got letters from home, and my folks, along with my sister, wrote me letters, pretty consistently. And so it was easy to keep, and I'd send them letters telling them what's going on to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And so that communication was fairly decent.
And you said that you're fortunate just to have the parents you did, but I think you kind of emphasize having them while you were over there.
My position, I was very fortunate. I had a lot of friends who were helicopter pilots. Not a lot, but I have a few friends who were outstanding helicopter pilots. One went on, I don't know how many missions. I still stay in touch with him. He's in Utah right now. But he flew, I don't know how many missions he flew, 30, 40, 50, and he never got shot down and never got really hit. And so all the crew chiefs that would get on these flights, either they really wanted to fly with this guy or they didn't want to fly with him because they figured his number was going to be up. But I was fortunate that I didn't lose any real close friends, and I did see some kids who were sons and husbands come back in body bags, and that colors your thoughts about how fortunate you are.
Wow. No, I guess I didn't ask, when you initially wanted to get into aviation, did you want to go fixed wing or helicopter?
I wanted to go fixed wing. I wanted to fly the fighters. That was my initial deal. I wanted to be a big jet jockey and fly the fast stuff. But that soon, I watched the people who did that, and even in Cherry North Carolina, we had some accidents where guys wound up flying the jet into the mud, and had a good friend who I played golf with there at Cherry Point, who was a naval dentist, and fortunately he did some dental work for me that I still have. But he had to go and identify some of these kids through dental records, because that was about all that was left of them.
Wow. Well, we can, I guess, start transitioning out of Vietnam. Is there anything we didn't talk about in country during this time period that you wanted to talk about?
I don't think so. I think we pretty well covered it. It was, we were just doing our jobs and doing what we were supposed to do there.
Yeah.
So
And then, so you came home, flew back home?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you're interested in that story,
Yes.
in early December, maybe it was December 2nd or something, I climbed on a plane, put on not my dress uniform, but the green uniform that Marines wear, and climbed on a C-130, and we were flown back to Guam for eventual transition to San Francisco to be released from the service. That was the end of my 5 years. And I sat next to a young Army private first class, I guess, and I looked at his uniform, and he had served in the 1st Cavalry Division, and he had been stationed at Dong Xoai, and I knew that we started talking. We had hours to talk,
Yeah.
and I started talking to him, and he said that he had been in Dong Xoai, and I'd heard that a unit had gotten overrun in Dong Xoai by the VC. Not totally overrun, but totally, a lot of people hurt and killed. And he started telling me his story, and it turns out he was in a foxhole with his best buddy, who was dead for 20 hours without any medical help. And finally they got him out. And so long story short, we flew to Guam and then got on another plane, or another plane, and went to San Francisco. And as we entered San Francisco, the pilot tipped his wings to the left, showed everybody on the right the Golden Gate Bridge, and then did the same thing on the right and tipped it to the right. And I was watching this little private, and the tears start streaming down his face. And I said, "Does that look pretty good to you, Private?" And he said, "Yes, sir, Lieutenant." He said, "About 3 or 4 weeks ago, I never thought I was going to see this place again." So that's not quite the end of the story. So we landed, and I wished him goodbye and a good Christmas. Hard for him to have a Merry Christmas, but I'm sure he had a Christmas with very mixed emotions. And he went his way, and I was in the process of being released. So I went. I put on my civilian clothes, checked into a nice hotel, went down to the restaurant, and I ordered 2 big whole glasses of whole milk. And I was sitting there just luxuriating and enjoying this whole milk, because we'd had powdered milk in it. And the couple next to me is arguing about how their steak is done. So that was a real lesson in tolerance and privilege and the real quality of life we have in the United States. So I think when you go through something, any wartime experience, you appreciate that. And I've always thought that it would really be a wonderful requirement for any person elected as president, or even some of our offices, responsible offices, to have gone through either combat or have been in the service in a war zone, because you really wind up appreciating what you have in the world. And even now, what was that? It's 40 years, 50 years later. I still have a great appreciation for just the simple things in life,
Wow.
the joys we have. So that's the story.
I know it's a man-made thing, a war zone, but I can't think of more of an unnatural place for a human to be in than a war zone. I can't imagine what life is like in a war zone.
Yeah. Well, I've always said I think it's people at their very best and people at their very worst, because it's the total spectrum of emotions, of what you go through, of stretch. I think the Marine Corps, too. I'm sure the Navy SEALs and all the other, most of the other services are good at trying to stretch you to your limits. And the Marine Corps is very good about taking right up to your limit and then easing off in the training, right up to, and each time it is a little further. And so I think that was the value that was good for me. I've often said I'd love to have my grandson go through Marine boot training, but I'm not sure with some of the leadership we've had in the past if I wanted him to be involved in a war. Because that you just don't know what the odds are.
Getting back to that flight, I mean, in your dad's war, after he was done, they had 4 or 5 week ship ride back home to kind of decompress. Here you are in a war zone, and probably not more than 24 hours later, you're back in civilization. What was that adjustment like? I once again can't imagine being in those conditions. The next thing you know, you're downstairs in a hotel drinking milk.
It was heaven because I came back. I had ordered a little Volvo P18 1800 coupe, and it was waiting for me there. And so it was just wonderful. I drove all the way back to Lubbock, Texas.
Oh.
And
so you mustered out in the Bay Area then?
Yeah, okay. That's where Treasure Island is where
okay.
you were released from the service.
Okay.
We were released then. And I drove back home, and that was the greatest Christmas I'd ever had. So
I can't imagine that reunion. Yeah,
so that was pretty special.
Did you have? I know things probably truly hadn't flared up with the protests and such, but did you have any problem? I know so many later on were told to take their uniforms off when they're in the airport and such. Did you encounter any of that stuff that early on?
No. Again, this was early in the deal, the 1965, December '65. So it was real early in the process, and I didn't even hear in Vietnam of people protesting in the United States and so forth. And quite frankly, after going through that, I quite frankly honored the people that protested against the war, because it was a crazy war.
Yeah, so I certainly want to zero in on that there a little bit. So now you're out of the service, and I guess kind of the sister question to the first question is, how was that transition then from one, just being in the Marines, but two, being overseas like that, going from that back to civilian life? Was that much of an adjustment, or did you take time off after the service, or what? Take your story now that you're out of the service.
No, I immediately applied. I wanted to be a golf club pro, not a touring pro, and so I immediately applied and was able to get a position at Phoenix Country Club. And because of my experience, they didn't let me teach or anything. They just let me take tee times and greet people in the pro shop and all that stuff. And eventually found someone in Tucson, a pro there, that offered me to come down and be the assistant, his only assistant. They had 2 or 3 assistants at Phoenix. His only assistant at Tucson Country Club, and he let me just occasionally teach, maybe the players that didn't have a lot of experience, or just beginners. So that was good. And from there, I decided that I was still a bachelor, and all my friends were off on Saturday and Sunday, and I was working in the golf shop on Saturday and Sunday. And I figured out real quickly that I had a degree in banking and investments from Texas Tech, and I said, well, maybe I'll go and be a stockbroker. So I went into the training and became a stockbroker there, and that was, I did that probably for a year or so.
And then continue on with your story.
Okay, from there, a good friend of mine that I'd grown up with in Lubbock, named Bob Evans, was a tennis pro, and he was the tennis pro at the Tucson Country Club, where I was the assistant golf pro. And he said, Lamar Hunt in Dallas is going to start up a world championship tennis tour, and they're probably going to look for a road manager or something like that. Why don't you apply for that? And I said, Bob, we played tennis in junior high, and I was terrible. Maybe not terrible, but I wasn't any good. And I said, I don't know. He said, well, I'm not sure they're looking for a tennis pro or somebody who's pro. I think they want somebody on the tour that can handle himself and manage and troubleshoot and stuff like that. So I said, okay. So I sent them a application, and they asked me to come to Dallas. So I went to Dallas and sat down and talked with them. I said, look, I was First Lieutenant of the Marine Corps. I had some responsibilities, and I said, I won't be calling you every 5 minutes if you want me to help you with. Well, that was music to their ears. They were starting a brand new tour, and it was everything was new, and they had a brand new crop of tours. This is kind of a side story, but the tennis pros at that point had been operating under shamateurism, and basically that was the amateur officials who control their own tournaments at each site, particularly around the United States and even in Europe, would pay the players the good players under the table to come to their tournaments, and yet the players couldn't turn pro, because if they wanted to play Davis Cup for their countries, they had to remain amateurs, and the pros were sick of this. So Lamar Hunt, after another group started called the Handsome Eight, started, and the Handsome Eight played in barns. They couldn't play in US LTA or LTA type sanctioned courts or events, so they had to play in. They set up a carpet court in gyms, old gyms and stuff, and the stories are great about that because they lobbed the balls up through the rafters, and these were good players, but they wanted to be pros, and they did some outlandish things, like they wore colored uniforms, blue and yellow, and instead of the white. And so Lamar started this tour, and they called me and said, we want you to come be the road manager. And I was shocked. So I left the brokerage business and went on tour, and it was a 4-month tour. It's the first 4 months of the year after the Australian Open, which is in January, because that's summertime. And they had the tournament from January through May, and they would play these different sites, Charlottesville, Houston, St. Louis, Philadelphia had the U.S. indoors, and so I would go around to these different sites and manage the competition and be the coordinator between the pros and the tournament director locally and the tournament sponsor and the Dallas office. So I was kind of in the middle a number of ways, and it was fun because I got a chance to do some real troubleshooting, but also to try. The one thing I wanted the players to know about me is that I would keep things fair. And it's interesting. All these guys had been their behinds had been powdered by all these people because they were famous tennis players, and so when they'd come to me with their specific problem. It's like in a court almost, because they had all their side of the story, and then here's another side of the story that I had to listen to and say, okay, here's how we're going to solve this. So that was really fun, interesting. Didn't make a lot of money, but I had a lot of fun and worked, 7 days a week, sometimes 18, 19 hours a day, because I had to get when the matches were over in the evening, I had to get the schedules under their doors, because the guys like to sleep late, but when they woke up, they wanted to know when they were playing, if they're playing at 2 o'clock or 1 o'clock or 7 o'clock at night. So that was fun.
Oh, wow. And so how many years did you do that then, or how many seasons?
I did that for, that's a good question. I did that for about 2.5 years, and then you can probably tell the dates there. And then they brought me back into the Dallas office to become the Tournament Bureau Director in the U.S. They had one in France too. And that's a Associated Tennis Professionals. I'm getting confused. So they brought me back in the Dallas office and made me tournament director and the director of the WCT finals. All of these events accumulated points to get to Dallas. And the top 8 went there, played quarterfinals, semifinals, and the final championship, which was called the World Championship of Tennis. So now the pros had a professional forum. They had prize money, which was put up by Lamar Hunt, and they had tournaments that were sponsored by savings and loans, breweries, insurance companies, banks that wanted their name nationally out because the sports writers would publish, this is the North Carolina National Bank Championships. So it worked pretty well. I don't think Lamar made any money off of it, but we had a lot of fun, and it started the players thinking about starting their own professional association, like the PGA is for golf. And so after a few, I've forgotten what year it is, but they decided they wanted to start the ATP, Associated Tennis Professionals. And they came to me and said, would you be our Los Angeles Tournament Bureau Director? And here's where they had a bureau director in France. And the head of the whole association in a volunteer position was Jack Kramer, the famous tennis champion. Many of your people won't know who he is, but he was a great Wimbledon champion and won at Forest Hills and so forth. And had his name on a bunch of rackets, which he made a lot of money of. And Jack wanted to be head of the Association of Tennis Professionals, and he did it without any salary, which is any time you have somebody that volunteers without a salary. But we went along for a while, and that was one of the years where the players voted to sit out Wimbledon because their prize money, they knew the officials that were running Wimbledon were making huge amounts of money, and the players weren't participating. So they boycotted Wimbledon and eventually raised the prize money, and now, of course, it's all professional. But those were interesting times in the tennis world. And so right about the time that I agreed to become the Los Angeles Tournament Bureau Director, Lamar Hunt came back to me and said, I need an administrative assistant, not to deal with the oil or anything, but just my sports. And it was a very tempting deal, but I knew if I didn't go and try the Associated Tennis Professionals that I would regret that the rest of my life because, look at what the PGA, I'd already seen what the PGA had done. But eventually, Jack would go over to England, and he was a wonderful man and a good leader, but he had a tough time sharing with, he was the leader, but he had a tough time sharing me what was going on. And so after a while, we developed the Associated Tennis Professionals ranking system and so forth. But after a while, I started looking back, and I was living in Los Angeles, and I decided, maybe I want to go back to Texas. And so I called Lamar Hunt. I said, "Is the job still open?" He said, "Oh yeah." He said, "Come on." So I came back and I worked with him with the Kansas City Chiefs and the Dallas Tornadoes Soccer Club, and there's another interesting story I guess we have time.
Oh, sure.
He owned 11% of the Chicago Bulls, and not too many people knew that. And in the later years, after I'd moved back to Colorado and so forth, and he owned the Chiefs, and he was coming to Denver for the Chiefs to play the Broncos. And through his secretary and assistant, he found me, and his assistant said, "Lamar would like for you to come and be a guest in his box for the game." So that was just a real thrill, and I went. We had a nice visit. I've got pictures of that, but I took a good friend with me, and the bottom line is I asked him. I said, "You still have your interest in the Chicago Bulls?" And he said, Yeah, he says, but it was a lot better when Jordan was there. So Lamar was a ultimate sports fan.
Was it? Yeah.
Yeah, he loved creating competitions, but he loved more than anything else filling arenas and getting people in to enjoy the thing. That was his juice. And so he was really great and just an incredible individual. You'd never know he had a dime. And of course he and the Hunt brothers were, they were what would be now multi-billionaires. But, and there's an interesting story with that side. We had for the Dallas finals in Dallas, we had the foreign press because they had people from France and England. And so we had a press conference there, and Lamar came there, and he was talking to the press and so forth. And the press conference was finished, and he came to me and says, "Bill, have you got any money on you?" Because he never carried cash, and his secretary would have to give him cash because it wasn't important. And so I said, "Sure." He says, "Give me $10." He said, "I need to get out of the parking lot." Here I am, giving money to a guy, and I'm making probably under $30,000 a year, and I'm giving money to a guy who's worth millions. And there are a lot of interesting stories about the Hunts and the oil and all that stuff. But that was a great experience.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Didn't make much money, but had a lot of fun and met a lot of incredible people.
Wow, celebrities and such, and.
Yeah, but people like Jesse Owens. We went to a banquet one night. He was there, and he made a statement once that we were talking about the players that were kind of the brats in the tennis at that time. John McEnroe, who's very respected now, but and he said, "Let me tell you something." He said, "You'll never have trouble with the greats. You'll only have trouble with the near greats." And of course, that can be true. It can't nowadays because the greats really sometimes are pretty temperamental.
Oh, so fascinating!
What a great run!
And then from there, you left there, and
I left there and went into a business for myself with a partner who was a gift type designer. And he had gone to Harvard, and he was just a genius type of guy. And he would design things like cedar wall liners, cedar wall things you hang in your closet that had cedar panels to put your clothes in, and library style magazine racks and stuff like that. So we made that. We did those for a while, and I made a small investment and was a partner, but that taught me something about business and so forth. It didn't last very long, and he became a professor or something, and I left and went back in the brokerage business.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, went back with a company called Rauscher Pierce Refness, which is a Texas firm, and then we decided we wanted to move to Colorado. And so I pretty much started over with an affiliate of theirs, Dane Rauscher, that was here. And so rest is pretty much history.
Now you said we wanted to move to Colorado, so I'm assuming.
My wife, yeah.
Yeah, so back up and talk about how you met her and wooed her.
Okay, June 10th, we will celebrate our 45th wedding anniversary. We met in Dallas, and that's kind of a long story I won't go into, but she had a very close friend of hers who died in a car wreck, and they were Glenda was married before, so these two gals had their own daughters about the same age, and they became soul sisters effectively. And so this one lady, beautiful, wonderful, smart lady, wound up teaching at Denver University, I believe, in business. Was in the car with her daughter, and long story short, they were in an accident, and she was killed. And so we decided that life's too short, and we drove out to Colorado and came across the Davidson Mesa there and saw this little town jammed up next to the big rocks, and we said, life's too short. Let's move here.
Wow.
So we moved there and we started all over again, and we lived in Shanahan Ridge, and then eventually in the early 80s we moved. We decided we wanted to live up in the mountains, so we bought a home right up near the top of Flagstaff Mountain, and we lived there for a while and had a big truck that we plowed snow. We were a mile from Flagstaff, so it was, snow up there a little bit different than down here, but even so we plowed snow for our driveway to the Flagstaff and also for our neighbors who lived along that drive. That was an experience.
Wow. And this whole time you were in wealth management, you stayed in that,
Yep.
and that's how you finished your career?
And Dane Bosworth was eventually, through a couple of iterations, taken over by RBC Wealth Management. So they were the final ones. And in 2006, I sold my business to people in the firm that I thought of. They had a nice group. If I'd have had more people to work with, it'd been fine. But working by yourself in that industry with all the regulations and compliance and everything, you had to go through an attorney before you could write a letter to your clients and all that stuff. So it got to be pretty convoluted.
And so you officially retired in 06 then?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right before 08, which I was very
Oh,
fortunate.
well,
that was a tough time.
Right. And have just enjoyed retirement
Yeah,
since?
I played a lot of senior golf competitively and enjoyed that.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a couple questions through that period of time, particularly after you got, you kind of experienced both sides of things. You were in the service up to 65, and then home from 65 until the war ended in 73 and saw the Tet Offensive flare up and all that. What were you thinking during this time period? You kind of talk a little bit about your thoughts on the war. Let's talk about that and everything you want to say about that.
Well, I guess if you saw, who was it that did the PBS special on Vietnam?
Walter Cronkite?
Huh?
Walter Cronkite?
No.
Ken Burns?
Ken Burns.
Yeah.
If you watch that series, you saw in the last episodes or so how poorly, isn't even a justifiable word, but how poorly that the politicians followed their own advice and so forth about the fact that they couldn't win the war. And yet they kept, because they wanted to be reelected. That was a very unpopular thing to draw troops after, so many thousand had died there. So it's interesting how war becomes a tar baby. Most people don't know what that story is, but how you get stuck in there after you commit so many resources to it. And the one thing I honor about the president now, President Biden, is that he hasn't gotten us committed other than material, ammunition, supplies, arms and so forth. Because
you're talking about Ukraine?
Yeah.
Okay.
You just can't get involved with those wars without plunging in it, particularly now, and fighting somebody like Russia, without it becoming all-encompassing. So there's some politicians, and I probably shouldn't mention names, but I will. George Bush did the same thing in Iraq. I wrote some lyrics to a song about the arrogance of ignorance. And I could see when we were going into Iraq, that same type of thing was happening. And sure enough, it did. And we had to pull out. And how many of our kids got killed or injured? And the interesting thing about now is the armament and the protective items are so sophisticated that you may not have quite as many people killed, but you have a lot of people coming home injured.
Right.
And that's even a tougher story for families that have to live with it, the PSD and so forth. So I have some really strong judgments on war. I know World War II was the great generation and we had to fight that. I really question whether we had to fight Vietnam and Iraq, and the integrity of politicians is almost directly related to whether they can get elected again.
Right.
And that's a harsh statement to make, but it's been my experience.
Sure. Now, talking about World War II and Vietnam and such, did your dad ever talk much about his war experiences? And prior to you going off, and then afterwards, did you guys ever sit down and over a beer or coffee and talk about individual experiences and various thoughts on war and such?
No, we really didn't. The fortunate thing is I was, 3 to 4 years old, and he would send me letters, and this minesweeper was the minesweeper was a wooden boat because of the magnetic mines, and so when they went out to sweep the harbors, the mines were set at lower depths to reach the big ships, to blow up the big ships, and they were stationed on the bottom of the coast or the whatever and of the ocean, and they had cables running up to these mines, and so the ship that my father was a commanding officer of was a wooden ship, and it had this huge apparatus on the back that they'd haul way up back in the back, and with a big saw on it, and it would cut these cables, and the mines would float up, and they'd shoot it with a gun and explode it way out there. And they call them wooden ships and iron men. And so my father, when they weren't sweeping for mines, they were keeping the ship ready and all that stuff, but they would fish, and they had a big huge hook made by a blacksmith, and they would throw that out with a piece of salt pork on it, and they caught sharks. And of course sharks aren't much good to eat, so dad would take the teeth out, and the shark's teeth are in layers, and in the letter he would send me these shark's teeth. You can imagine at age 3 or 4 getting something from your father that you'd had very little knowledge of, with the shark's teeth and the letters and a few pictures of the crew and all that stuff. So that's the way I lived through World War II. And then when he got home, he immediately went to work for the Corps of Engineers, building dams and stuff like that as a civil engineer. And so we didn't talk about the war much. It wasn't something and I was 5 or 6 or 7, and my interests were really other places.
But years later, after you came home from your service, was there much talk then? Or?
We really didn't. Again, my father worked from 7 in the morning till 7 at night, and I won't say he was a workaholic, but the man just really loved what he did, and we never got to sit down and talk a lot. He was not particularly athletic because of his work, and he just was a very duty-oriented guy, and that was impressive to me.
Right. And how about so many people that have served overseas in war zones and such will come back with, I won't go to the extreme of PTSD, but just from experiences. Were you able to leave whatever rough experiences you had back there, or did any of that ever float to the top over the years? Thoughts and dreams, or?
I think I left most of it behind. I think I felt very fortunate in that I didn't have any hand-to-hand combat situations or situations where I might have been more damaged mentally or whatever. There were impressions that were made on me, yes. The one by the kid flying back with me from Vietnam was a deep impression. I was in a squadron of fighter. I was temporarily assigned to a squadron of fighter jet pilots, and one or two of those were lost. The naval aviator is a particularly incredible blend of pilot, because they have to land on carriers, but sometimes they have to land at night on carriers, and that's one reason I'm kind of glad I didn't qualify as a pilot. But yeah, you know, at 83, it emphasizes to me that life is just full of a bunch of different experiences, and you look at them and you realize you got to handle them, and you got some choices, you know, and you make the choices of handling them in the best way you can and trying to come out the other side.
Well, that kind of segues into the question I usually like to ask at the very end, but I'll ask now. As you look back on that experience as a Marine and going overseas, how did that play on you? Did it change your life, play a role in your life, affect your life at all? Or you just simply see it as just a chapter in your life? How would you answer that?
No. The Marine Corps, for any young man, or particularly kid who doesn't know what he wants in life and has had very little discipline in life or had some rough times and so forth, I've seen so many. I was fortunate, I had parents, but I served with so many, you know, particularly in boot camp, the type of boot camp we had and the training. I served with so many young people who didn't have a family, and or had their mother, or you know, their father left, or it was just tragic situations, and man, they came out super. So I highly recommend the training. I don't recommend the wars that sometimes follow it, but the training is, and I know it's gotten harsher. I know there's some abusive stuff that goes on, but I think they're starting to cut that out pretty much. But if you're led right up to the level of what you think you can take, and then backed off a little bit, I know the SEALs. They're led right up to it, and then they keep pushing them. Yeah. And of course, that's the reason they flunk out so many people. I was involved in a charity here where we organized golf tournaments for the benefit of student vets at University of Colorado in Boulder. And the fellow that runs the veterans portion of that at CU is a captain, a former SEAL, and I asked him one time, I said, what is the difference in the guys that make it and the guys that don't? And he said, just pointed here, he says, it's all mental. He said, I've had Olympic athletes that flunked. He said, I've had kids that were physically incredible specimens and pretty good thinkers. But he said the people that can go through it mentally with that type of that they can persevere in that type of stuff, those are the ones that make it through.
Wow, yeah, I've heard that as well. Yeah. Through the years, did you keep in touch with any of the guys you served with? Any sort of reunions, anything like that?
No reunions. I think when I got out, I was ready to, wipe my hands. But there's one fellow and I who stayed, a helicopter pilot, Skip Junker in Utah, who we send Christmas cards and occasional cards to, and we talk on the phone occasionally. And he's got a totally different life than I do, but that's about the only time. We don't talk about the service much. He tells me a little about a few of his harrowing experiences of landing on a hospital ship with a guy and trying, the ship's rolling and he's keeping one wheel on the ship and stuff like that. So I guess we get some interesting stories.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of shifting gears, jumping back and forth, but we'll start winding down this, but we'll end with family. You talked about meeting and marrying Glenda, but talk a little about your family.
I have a daughter, Christine. She's actually my stepdaughter, but her father wasn't real active in her early life, and I came in when she was 10 years old, and I admired her mother tremendously because her mother had worked during the day, gone to school at night to get her degree, and dated some on the weekend. So this little 10-year-old redheaded daughter had been on her own and pretty damn independent. And so we eventually got along, but when I was working for the tennis, I was around all these tennis stars, and I was a rock star because I was managing all these guys.
Yeah.
And but when we got married, I kind of became the Marine second lieutenant, first lieutenant. My kids will always do this, do that. Well, they'll say yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full. Not happening with her. She let me know real quick that I wasn't in charge. And but we became very loving, and it's one of the great assets and relationships that I have in my life now.
Wow.
Is her. She's running a restaurant called the Dream Cafe in Dallas, and she worked her tail off during the pandemic, and shuttle meals out to cars and stuff like that. And now the restaurant's just going gangbusters. There's nothing better than watching your kids succeed.
Yeah. Wow.
You've worked yourself out of a job.
Yeah. Excellent. And you've got one grandson?
And a grandson, Wesleyan. Wesleyan is 16 years old. A year and a half ago, he was here on me. Now he's here. He'd gone through an incredible growth spurt. We encouraged him a little bit in golf, but he wasn't interested until some of his buddies started playing. And then he got really interested, so I was able to mentor him a little bit there and help him out, and we got him some lessons. And year before last, he barely made the golf team with in high school, and now this year's a sophomore. He qualified in the middle of the team, so I'm really happy for him because he's got something besides phones and computers to do. But he's got a good group of friends in Dallas. He's just a really good kid, and I'm just looking forward to how he progresses, and matures.
Yeah. Well, we'll start winding down this interview. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about, or any stories that have floated that you thought about that are floating to the top while we've been here sitting talking about? I know we only probably got a tip of your iceberg of your story, but anything else that we can hopefully round out your story, or do you think we've pretty much covered as best we can and covered everything you're happy with? I mean, I as I look just over your overview of your life, I mean, it seems like you were always kind of a little bit ahead of the curve. You know, a little bit ahead of the curve in Vietnam, right at the beginning of Vietnam. Ahead of the curve and right at the beginning of the pro tennis circuit. I mean, it seems like you're just right on the cusp of the beginning of some major things.
Yeah, I think a lot in life is how fortunate you are to be in a certain cycle. I have been extremely lucky in just my life, my parents, my surroundings. Especially now, as you get older, my friends.
Yeah.
That's the biggest relationship. We have a men's group in our church that has been incredible as far as just supporting you and allowing you to be vulnerable and that type of stuff. But no, I'm just very, every night I say thank you because my life has been a wonderful deal. I've got some challenges. As you get older, you expect physical stuff to start happening, mental stuff. If you play golf, you start seeing the yardages decrease like this because it's a linear game. But I'm enjoying now, kind of reviewing. I'm not enjoying some of the the downsides that you got to. But I'm participating. For example, in June for an aging conference, we have someone coming into our church, and we have he's going to talk to us about making the most of your later life. I've written a guide about end-of-life experiences and how you organize your. I was a certified financial planner,
right,
and
sure, yeah.
so I've over the last few months I've organized a little file on that I can share with people. I'm not charging anything. I'm just, but those are kind of the ways I'm using experience. But no, I'm just happy with what's going along and trying to shoot lower golf scores.
Well, I think that'll be a good one to end this interview on. I want to thank you for sitting down to tell your story today, but just as important, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you, Brad, and I appreciate what you're doing. It's important because you're creating a record. Thank you.
Yep.